Welcome to Rehash, a Web3 podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and in this episode we are talking all things DAOs. We'll be talking about DAO culture, DAO tooling and infrastructure, DAO governance, and so much more with Stefen Deleveaux. He's a growth lead at Govrn, president of the Caribbean Blockchain Alliance, and a contributor at the DAOist, Prime DAO, and many other places. Welcome, Stefen. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hey, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So before we dive into all things DAOs, can you tell people a little bit about your background, maybe what you were doing before Web3 and what was it about Web3 that grabbed your attention initially?
That's a long one. So my background's in economics. I did the whole banking and finance circuit, I guess you could call it. And actually, this was mainly around 2013, 2014. I was really into fintech and all the things that were kind of building up around there. And I kind of realized that. So, for background, I'm from the Bahamas, always been very passionate about the Caribbean in general. And I realized a lot of what I thought was really cool about fintech, I would, try to use it back home and realize, I can't access it. It doesn't work down here. I remember actually trying to tweet at Stripe for probably the better part of 10 years. Actually, yeah, it was definitely like a full decade. Like, please come to the Bahamas, please come to the Bahamas. And yeah, nothing. It still doesn't work even now. So yeah, I just realized very quickly that the ethos and the goals around fintech were incomplete. One, because they were still completely attached to the traditional financial system. And then two, because they weren't global by default. A year later, around like 2015, I started actually paying attention to what we considered blockchains in the blockchain space, and like how it worked and the underlying tech around it. And I realized, wait, this is actually the new revolution or the evolution that I've been looking for this whole time. So from then, I just like paid more attention, got passionate about it. We started the Caribbean Blockchain Alliance end of 2016, and then it was really just a small community of people in the region who were really passionate about it. It was, somewhere between like 6 to 10 people. But over time, that community grew. We got a lot of people from different backgrounds, at least like economic backgrounds, people who were just focused on different parts. So it was this interesting mix of like, Bitcoiners, like people who worked in like the private blockchain space, people who were at the beginning of the kind of Web3 before it was Web3, if you think about it in terms of like DeFi, NFTs, DAOs, that kind of thing. So yeah, it was 2020 when I'd kind of, because I'd always been doing Caribbean Blockchain Alliance on the side, and I still had, a normie job back then in the kind of development economics ecosystem. So 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, it was June, I left my job and decided to go into crypto full time, decided to go into Web3 full time. And coincidentally, that was when, DeFi summer was already happening. I got into NFTs like right after that. And then end of 2020, I fell into the DAO space and just fell in love with it. That was actually largely because I was already thinking a lot about not only decentralized systems, but also, organizations and communities that were decentralized, that were autonomous, and how they kind of interacted and operated. So it's been kind of a whirlwind these last few years, just kind of getting into all of the awesome stuff about the space.
Yeah, for sure. And now that you've been deep in DAOs for well over a year, maybe coming up on a couple of years, what are you most bullish about with DAOs today? Like, whether it's the same reason that got you into DAOs in the first place, or whether your thinking has evolved over the last couple of years, like, what are you most bullish about with regards to DAOs today?
Yeah, they've definitely evolved, and I go back and forth on a lot of different things. And the way I thought about DAOs, when I first got into them versus now, still fairly similar. I think a lot more about, let's say, tooling, for example, that I wasn't thinking about at all back then. But what I'm most bullish about is just the open expanse of what we can do. Like, for example, with your podcast, you're already showing that you can do a podcast DAO, which is kind of wild. And it's also like, it's not attached to a DeFi product. It's actually creating an entirely new like structure that is focused on the community, and it's focused on still you doing what you're doing, but also in a completely different way. So I think it's just being able to do completely new things in ways that we haven't thought of before. I think the more we experiment with DAOs, the more we experiment with like DAO tooling, DAO structures, governance styles, all these different things, we're going to create a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So for people who maybe aren't as familiar with DAOs, how would you, I guess, describe the current state of the DAO ecosystem? And maybe if you can compare it to an era of the past so people can better understand, because I found it's helpful for people to analogize things that we're doing in Web3 to things that happened in Web2 or Web1 in the past.
Mm.
How would you describe where we are with DAOs today? Would you say this is like equivalent to the internet in the 90s or social media back in like the early 2000s, or how would you describe it?
I think I look at it a little differently. So, for example, the thing that made me realize how much I was going to spend time in the DAO space to begin with, for my undergrad thesis, I did my thesis on cooperatives, worker cooperatives specifically, and just this general idea of what would the economy, what would society look like if co-ops were just much more proliferated. Like there was more of a balance of co-ops versus traditional firms. And then when I really started paying attention to DAOs, I had a realization of, oh, this is kind of that future. This is kind of what we're building with DAOs. So I definitely think a lot in terms of DAOs, in terms of similarities to cooperatives, especially in terms of decentralizing the governance, creating this ownership that the participants have rather than just the people at the top, for example, rather than traditional hierarchical structures. You have something that's maybe, maybe not completely flat, but more flat and more fluid than what we're typically used to in the jobs that we have and the work spaces that we create. So that, and of course, it's also interesting that, cooperatives aren't new. Cooperatives have been around for a very long time. These kind of communities of people who interact and operate in a very decentralized way, in a very, non or at least minimally hierarchical way. So I do always go back to those like mental models and ideas when I think about DAOs and how they could be structured. And of course, I also think because of this technology that we're using, we can go even further and do a lot of things in maybe more, or at least more modern ways at the end of the day. But we still have to figure out what that looks like.
Right. I do think DAOs are kind of like the modern day co-ops, or you could say it the other way around. Co-ops were the original DAOs before
Right.
DAOs were a thing. But I think, anybody who has been part of a co-op or is familiar with a co-op from back in the day maybe realizes that there were some issues with co-ops too. There are lots of benefits with co-ops, but there were a lot of issues too. Like, for instance, I was just in New York talking to my friends one of my friends owns a condo in a co-op in New York, which is interesting because I think New York is one of the only cities, at least that I've heard of, that does that, where you can own a condo in a co-op. And she was saying how difficult it is to not only sell her condo, but even to lease it out to somebody, because you have to get the board at the co-op to approve it. And if
Right.
you get stuck with a few, grouchy people on the board who just want to say no to everything, then it makes it very difficult for you to lease out your place or sell it or do anything with it without the co-op's approval. So looking back to the last couple of years that you've been in the DAO space, what would you say are some of the things that we've done really well so far with DAOs? And maybe what are some of the things that we've done not so well, or that we can really use some work on in the upcoming periods of time?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I mean, at the end of the day, it all comes back to governance. And I think that's something that we're very open about in the DAO space in terms of we're still figuring all this out. We don't know what the optimal or even the near optimal way to do governance is. Obviously, one of the main things is that we're realizing that the raw, old style, like token based governance is probably not the best structure because there's already so many problems around that. But it's also something that I definitely think will kind of transfer over time, kind of progress over time. Everyone's already focusing on, the conversations around like verifiable credentials and soulbound tokens or contribution based governance. Like there's a lot of experimentation happening right now. So I think at the end of the day, what we are really good at doing is experimentation, is trying to figure out, trying to tweak, like what should we be focusing on next? What should we be doing next? And yeah, I try to remind people all the time, like these things take time. No DAO is going to be perfect. Even in the next few years, we still have a lot of iteration to do. We have a lot of exploring to do. I think the most important thing is that we just have to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're one, open-minded about it. Two, we're kind of developing these learnings and kind of sharing them across the ecosystem. I think, our connections to the ecosystem itself are our connections to just collaborative structures in terms of how DAOs operate with each other. The fact that you can so much easier have, a contributor that works for multiple DAOs, for example. And then at the same time, that also can create either a collaboration or even just shared learnings at the end of the day. That's something that I think is really powerful. And just, the DAO to DAO collaboration is going to be where the space becomes strongest. So I think, there's still a lot to figure out, but it's improving really quickly.
When we think about DAO governance, do you think it's helpful to look back on models of the past? Like, for example, I think when most people think of governance, they think of, like voting for our president, for example, or voting for our local electives. That's what most people are familiar with when it comes to governance. Do you think it's helpful to look back at governance models like that have existed for decades in our society? Or do you think it's more useful for us to try and think in a more innovative way, like you were saying, do more experiments, not be afraid of that, to sort of develop new governance models?
Yeah, I'm a huge proponent of looking back and seeing what's come before. And not even decades. I mean, like, if we go back centuries and even millennia, humans have operated in so many different ways, and a lot of those ways were decentralized. A lot of those ways were autonomous, at least in the sense of like self-driven, self-organizing. All these various groups, all these various like communities that have tried different styles of governance themselves to varying degrees of success. But I think that's how we should be, starting. But at the very least, these are the conversations that we should be having. Like, what have people done before? People do tend to bring up Greece, for example, or we can talk about the Mondragon community in Spain that is mainly focused on, like, again, cooperatives, but they do it in very interesting kind of hierarchical and semi-hierarchical ways, where you still have the leaders, but in a lot of co-ops you see, going back to co-ops, a lot of co-ops you see you have like leaders, you have like managers and stuff like that, but they're more fluid, meaning that maybe you can vote on whether this manager stays on or whether he steps down, and you put someone else on. But it's really just more of a democratic way of doing things. But there's so many examples. I talk a lot about, like, the Rojava community in Syria, like the Zapatistas, and even today, so many groups that are doing different things in terms of how they do governance that are more decentralized, that DAOs could really learn, and the DAO space could learn so much from. Yeah, I mean, we could also look at more traditional forms that we're used to, like republic style governance, but we could also look away from this. But at the same time, I do definitely think there is a level of, oh, we have access to technologies that those folks did not have access to before. So we do need to, I think, combining the two, where we're trying to utilize what's been done in the past and then going forward and saying, okay, well, we can try this, we can do this. Those most of the co-ops in the past didn't have NFTs, so we can figure out new ways to do things too.
Right, right. So if you had to summarize all of your learnings from studying these past governance models, what would you say are some of the key principles that apply to governance generally, whether we're talking about, ancient Greece or whether we're talking about DAOs? Like, governance should always have certain aspects to it or certain like properties to it.
That's a great question. It's also something I think about a lot, and I don't really know the best answer to. But so far, I think one of the things that's most important is just the idea of everyone having a voice, and that may not necessarily be like a one-to-one. Everyone has the same amount of vote power or voting rights, but you have to at least have the access. You have to at least have your voice come into consideration. It shouldn't be completely top down. It shouldn't be like one person kind of rules all. I know people will disagree with me. Some people will disagree with me on that. That's just like how I really think about things. Something I found really interesting when I was doing the pieces on co-ops, when you're looking at how the workers operate, how they kind of interact, they're typically happier and more productive actually than in regular firms, because it's like you have more ownership of the entity, of the company, or whatever it is. and you have more say in how it happens, and you have more upside when it does well. So when you do that, you're just more incentivized to make sure that things go according to plan, things go as they should. I think honestly, at the end of the day, incentivization is very powerful. It should be used in certain places, should not be used in certain places. But I think figuring out where incentives are best is going to be really key for the DAO space. We're definitely not there yet. We have a long way to go. But that's just one of the things I'm thinking about.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier too something else that was like a thing that DAOs can improve upon, and that's this token-based governance system. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what you see as being some of the problems with token-based governance and what you propose as a better solution to what we have now?
I feel like I'm going to get in trouble there. So I'll just give a quick example. Like Uniswap has gotten a lot of flack for their governance. It is fully token based. VCs do own a large amount of it. And there are a lot of questions on, okay, who really gains the most from the decision making that happens? Who is, again, best incentivized? So there's a lot of questions around things like that. And we see that same kind of style in a lot of the various DAOs, especially the DeFi DAOs. But at the same time, we're seeing a lot of experimentation in terms of like hybrid models between like tokens and NFTs, which I think is a really good primitive, or even just like raw NFT governance. That none of these are perfect, but at the same time, we're like, okay, let's see if this works. Okay, that's not working. Let's try this. So I think the combination and learnings that are coming from all of these are really helpful, actually. Which again is why there's so much buzz around this idea of soulbound tokens and what it means when you're not fully token based, when you actually have non-transferable governance, and what that means, and what conclusions going to come out of that. I do definitely try to avoid like this is the best style or this is my favorite style, because I'm completely open-minded in terms of figuring out what people are doing. I am a big fan of token and NFT hybrid governance, but I'm just kind of watching and seeing at this point. And I think also we haven't really gotten there yet, but there's definitely going to be a trend towards contribution-based governance. So the people who are doing certain amounts of work or certain levels of work will have more say in certain scenarios or in certain structures. I think that's going to be really interesting. But the key to that is going to be like contribution management, which hasn't really existed yet, but we're kind of working on as well. Yeah, it's just really interesting to see all the different kinds of things popping up, and I'm just really excited.
Yeah, I'm super bullish on contribution-based governance as well, just because I don't believe you have to spend like any amount of money in order to have governance rights in a DAO. If you're able to put in your time and your skills and your effort into it, then that should be enough for you to have a say in the DAO. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this like hybrid token and NFT, so like ERC20 tokens and NFT governance model. In what circumstances do you see NFTs being a better governance token tool versus ERC20s?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think just on the level of they're not as liquid as ERC20 tokens, meaning that there's just less incentive to sell them. Even if they're like some are financial based, some are not financial based. But just the fact that they're less liquid does kind of help with making sure that governance goes to the people that either most involved or most active or things like that. At the same time, and this is actually something that my thinking has changed on, because I used to be extremely bullish on full token based governance, just because I did see liquidity as a benefit, meaning that that meaning that kind of coincides with your incentive to be a part of the ecosystem, to buy and sell as you please. But yeah, as we've seen, it's probably not the best structure. And then at the end, same idea, there's still so many questions around like whether it should be still transferable, whether it should be non-transferable. I don't want to get too deep into that, but I think it's going to be some. I think NFT based governance could also be fully integrated into like contribution based governance, where when you do contributions, you may hold a certain level of NFT, and there may be different like tiers and whatnot. But yeah, still a lot of open questions.
For sure, yeah. And I think that's why we need all of these DAO tooling companies. And I know you just joined Govrn recently, which handles governance, or is that not the full picture?
So it's mostly, I think of it as contribution management. So in the same way that, you have a lot of tools that are focused on treasury management, Govrn is focused on contribution management. So this idea of contributor ownership, where you as a contributor to whatever DAO it is, you're basically recording what you've done, recording your work, recording your own contributions. And you can also, also in a way that you kind of have that full control over. And at the same time, you can also choose to mint it on chain and get it and mint it as an NFT, right? So there's already this kind of hybrid coming out of that. And I think the beauty of that is that, no matter where you go, whether you leave a DAO and go to and start work on another DAO, or something really bad happens with the DAO and it gets like co-opted or just decides to wind down, you always have this record of what you've done. You've always had this record of not just the work that you've done, but the contributions you've made, and maybe like even other interactions that you could think of that are yet you find really important. And at the same time, then whatever DAO you work for can be like, okay, we can make sure you get paid based off of this. And the DAO could even say, well, we need 2 or 3 other contributors to validate this. That's perfectly fine. You can do that as well. But I think that's going to just be the start of a lot of not just interactions in general, but also like DAO to DAO collaborations. Because now that, let's say I'm working with 2 DAOs, I'm kind of recording contributions. Maybe let's say I'm working with the DAOist and I'm working with Prime DAO, right? Because both of them can basically see the work I've done. They're like, oh, what you're doing for this one actually is really helpful for this. We want to make sure you do that for us too. Or they can do it in a way where, oh, if you do it for one, we'll pay you for both. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. That just kind of doors that open up. And then you build this bridge basically between 2 DAOs who may or may not have been interacting before, but now you've created whole new collaborations, whole new, maybe even partnerships based on your own contributions. So what Govrn does is kind of focus on the contributor first and focus on your work being what powers these DAOs and the DAO ecosystem in general. And I think that's also super aligned with co-ops and how co-ops operate, because it's also focused on your work, your productiveness being in tune with everyone else's work. So it's kind of building out this contribution graph in the long run where we can actually see how these DAOs are growing and are doing things based on individual work.
Super cool. So it's essentially like an on-chain GitHub repo, but for all DAO contributions and not just for devs.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think the cool thing too is that, your DAO could be pushing, say, Clarity, another DAO could be pushing Wonderverse. You're working with both, and you're like, how do I do this? Govrn kind of can interoperate with either of them. And that's why like the composability is probably one of my favorite words. I think that's just powerful. And I think we're going to see a lot of just really cool interactions and really cool like collaborations and seeing how different communities and different DAOs can work together just based off the people who are part of it and the work that they're doing.
Yeah, I actually see contribution management as being the core of a lot of the problems that we face in DAOs today, and the ability to solve that, being able to fix a lot of the problems. Like, I think on the one hand, it's like you're saying, you're able to see any duplicate work that you're doing from DAO to DAO. But on the other hand, it's for somebody who doesn't have a big name in the space yet and is kind of like unknown, they have to build up their reputation
Right.
in a DAO when they start contributing. But then when they go over to the next DAO, they want to, a new DAO spins up, they feel super passionately about that, they want to contribute to that. It's almost like they have to start all over from ground zero and start building that reputation again. And so I think tools like this are super helpful. It can also help with compensation too on the back end,
Right.
Because it just makes it a lot more visible, like what is the work that you're actually contributing and how much should you get paid for that.
Yeah, it's interesting too because a lot of DAOs, especially some of the larger ones, they don't necessarily know what contributors are doing. And then at the same time, contributors don't necessarily know if the work they're doing is as helpful to the DAO as it should be, for example. And there's kind of a gap there and there needs to be more alignment. And I definitely think contribution management is going to be huge in just like building the alignments within these DAOs themselves, let alone alignments between other DAOs. So yeah, I think it's going to be a really powerful primitive.
For sure. So aside from Govrn, what are some other DAO tools that you're really excited about right now?
So everyone who knows me knows I love Prime DAO. I think Prime DAO is definitely one of the main, DAOs building DAO to DAO collaboration in general, and they do it in a very trustless way, which is very cool. And I think so. There's already been a lot of collaboration in terms of like token swaps and things like that, but they've typically if you ask people in DAOs who've done token swaps, they'll tell you it's kind of a manual thing. You have to manage it a lot. You have to interact with the whole community and like get everyone's approval and things like that. But at the same time, it's also you have to do it in a way that's not trustless. You have to make sure that the people you're swapping with, the people you're doing whatever with, are on the up and up. And just a lot of relationships to manage. So what Prime DAO does is just kind of allow you to do things like that in trustless ways. Like they've built out Prime Deals, which is focused on the token swaps. They're building out Prime Pools, which allows for a lot of different stuff like shared liquidity and things like that. And I think for me in general, and you can kind of see it with Prime DAO and with Govrn and with the DAOists actually, because they bring DAOs together in real time, IRL. It all kind of centers around this idea of the DAO ecosystem being interlinked and being networked together. To me, I think that's the best way that DAOs can actually proliferate and spread everywhere, building these networks of interoperable, interacting communities.
I think one thing that people really like about the DAO ecosystem right now is this attitude of WAGMI, right? Where it's like, if I have a media DAO and you have a media DAO, the first thing we'll think is, well, we should work together. We should collaborate. We should see how we can partner together. We can see like what cool stuff we can do together, which is very different from the attitude in the traditional Web 2 space, which is very competitive. Like in the Web 2 space, it would be like, if I have a media DAO, you have a media DAO, all of a sudden
We're
I'm
enemies.
like, oh man, we're enemies. Like you've got a huge target on your back.
Right.
I've got a huge target on my back. Like we're both thinking, how can we beat the other one out? Do you see this WAGMI attitude lasting in the long run in the DAO space? Or do you think it's just because we're so early and the space is so small that we can all still work together, but that it'll change as this ecosystem grows and there are more and more of these? And, at the end of the day, it's like, you can't have like 100 players in one thing, like in governance tooling or
Right.
in like something else. Like somebody's going to end up quote unquote, I guess, like winning and losing, for lack of better words.
That's a really good question. So, I mean, I definitely, my feelings on this are, in the same way that two companies who are trying to do the same thing will basically always end up competing. Two DAOs that are doing the same thing, or multiple DAOs that are doing the same thing, have so many opportunities and options to collaborate and for collaboration in general. That's one of the main reasons I see DAOs as being this like next level of human coordination. But in terms of does that last, actually, it's a tough one. I idealistically think that it will actually accelerate. It'll actually improve because there will be so many more tools that make it easy for collaboration. So, for example, if we build up this network of media DAOs that all have done token swaps, for example, and this, of course, is also assuming that we're still using tokens like 10, 20 years down the line for DAOs specifically. But let's say we are. If we're doing token swaps, and okay, now I own a part of you, you own a part of me, we own a part of that DAO over there. It's just harder for me to, attack you or try to like do anything negative against you, because now if you go down, that hurts me as well. But if you do well, that helps me as well. So why not work together to continue to collaborate and things like that? I do agree it does get harder just as the space gets bigger because there are just so many different actors. But I'm just bullish on the tool space in general, that we're going to find so many ways to allow that to happen. So like even with prime pools, you could have like 5 media DAOs all having an index together kind of thing. So there are definitely a lot of options. So even if we have that, there are other things that make it easier to like make it harder to collaborate. Sorry, like if we have limited talent, for example, then the DAOs will still end up competing over talent. But I think with things like with primitives like contribution management, it does, also make it easier for that limited talent to work across multiple DAOs. So it's a lot of small things that just kind of come together and make that collaboration continue to happen no matter what.
Yeah, thinking about talent and how DAOs are going to source talent in the long term makes me think about culture in DAOs, because I really think with the flexibility that DAOs offer to people with regards to work, I think people are really going to go to the DAOs that have the best culture,
Mm.
that they feel like, they can vibe with the most and that aligns with their values the most. So when you think about DAO culture, what do you think are some of the most important elements of DAO culture that we should be thinking about, talking about, or what are some of maybe like the most important questions that we should be asking ourselves with regards to culture in DAOs? Because this is sort of like a very subjective area, right? And people, I think, don't like to talk about or focus
Yeah.
on some of these like more softer areas or more subjective areas because it's hard to know what the answer is. But I do think that culture is going to play a really big role in which DAOs end up, growing the fastest and making the biggest impact.
Yeah, that's a great question. To be honest, I think the culture aspect just kind of happens in real time in terms of, okay, so what am I joining this DAO for? I really vibe with at least what they're trying to do. But let's say the culture's off. You're like, okay, I do want to do something in this realm, but not with this DAO. I generally think it will be pretty easy as the space, continues to rise, as we see hundreds to actually, sorry, thousands more DAOs pop up, and also focused on a lot of different things in different ways and different niches, and also focused on like, different geographic communities or physical locations. It's just going to be a lot easier to find those specific DAOs that you will mesh with, or at the very least, if you find a large DAO that does that, which you want to do, it becomes easier to create like either fork that off or create like sub DAOs that have a bit more alignment in terms of the culture. So yeah, I don't know. This is definitely something I think kind of like works out on its own, but it's still very important. It's just so weird right now because the cultures are very similar in a lot of ways. Like there are a lot of different DAOs doing different things, but they're still largely focused on the same demographics or people who are or were early to Web3, for example. So we see a lot of the same names come up a lot of the time. But I think at the same time, we've seen with DAOs, or at least communities that are progressively decentralizing into DAOs, like Boys Clubs, SheFi, and those kinds, that are actually onboarding new people in real time. And I think the interesting thing about those is that, a lot of the members are new to the space in general, and they love it, and they're seeing in real time what the space looks like, and at the same time, they're kind of driving the culture themselves. I guess in my words, I would say it's less important what the DAO culture is as you come into it, and it's more important whether you can actually add to that culture, whether you can actually affect that culture. What are you doing to make it, I don't know, maybe more inclusive or more focused on what people need, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I saw somebody tweet this, I think it might have been Gem after NFT NYC last week, about how, like we've been in the space for a while, like we have friends in the space. I see you at these conferences and makes me very happy. But for people who are new to the space and they don't know anyone, they don't already have friends, to go into these parties or these like side events at NFT NYC, it can feel actually like pretty off-putting. And that's what Jem was saying in his tweet,
Yeah.
because it's a very homogenous group of people. It's basically like a bunch of bros. And if you're not, like a white bro, then it feels like, like nobody else is there that looks like you or that maybe you feel comfortable approaching when you don't know anyone. So I think, you and I, we can both agree that this is a problem in the space. But from your view, what are some of, I guess, like the most high impact things that people like us can do in the space to make it more inclusive and to make it feel more welcoming to people who aren't already in the space and who don't already know people and have friends in the space?
Yeah. That's a complex problem. It's also something that I think about a lot, just because I've been doing Caribbean Blockchain Alliance, which is focused mostly on education in the Caribbean, mostly with people who don't have access to a lot of traditional financial anything in a lot of ways, but also have not really been incredibly quick to access, like to get into Web3 for various reasons. To be honest, I think at the end of the day, it's all about creating a different party, creating a better party. So what I mean by that is if you give people access to tools that they need and can use, they're gonna create their own thing no matter what. I do really think that instead of like trying to bring a bunch of people into what already exists, being a group, a specific community, or whatnot, if we give them the access to the tools, if we give them and at the same time give them the ethos of what we're trying to build or how it could help them, then they throw their own parties, right? And they're doing stuff in their own communities. And then of course at the end of that there will be some level of interaction, or maybe even hopefully some level of collaboration. But I think the most important thing at the bottom line is just like making sure everybody has access. And then once that happens, then everyone can make their own decisions. They can figure out where they want to go. They can easily say, "Oh, everyone's going to that party, but I don't like that party. So me and my friends are going to do this over here." But at the same time, they're still empowering themselves. They're still creating the solution, being like whatever it may be, whether it's like a DeFi project or an NFT project, whatever it may be. They're still doing the work. They're still getting things done. It's just going to be in a different way.
Yeah, I think that's a really empowering message for people listening who are newer to the space too. Because I know when I joined the space back in late 2020, I felt like I was too late. Like I didn't know anything. So many people already knew more than me. Like it was too late for me to really make an impact or do my own thing. And obviously that was not true. That was just a misconception that I held. And I think a lot of people hold that misconception today, especially after the bull market last year of NFTs blowing up. People saw that it really like hit the mainstream quite a bit. And people entering now probably think like, oh, it's too late for me to make an impact. But no, like you're saying, like it's all about just educating yourself, understanding the ethos of what we're trying to build here, and then really like using your ideas and your background and experiences to create the most impactful projects or the most fun parties for other people to participate in.
That's going to be really important. Like if you look at the statistics right now, I think it's around like 300 million people that use crypto. I don't know how actively that factors in, but that's such an interesting number to me because it's already like the mainstream idea about crypto right now is that it's all like white tech bros. The fact that there are 300 million people using it means, one, that's not true, but at the same time, obviously there's still so many more people to bring in, so it's still a wide open space, and then so many other communities, so many groups of people that can use crypto and don't yet. That just means that this entire space is going to look incredibly different within 5 to 10 years. Let's say, let's conservatively 5 to 10 years. But with all these different groups that are even currently focused on like education, onboarding, bringing in people, we're going to see a rapid change in what crypto looks like and what Web3 looks like and what the DAO ecosystem looks like. Because at the same time, so far we've definitely focused a lot on like the larger DAOs and like everyone trying to figure out organization and governance in these large DAOs. But I think it's really like the small DAOs in these small communities that are going to drive so much change, and that's the most important thing. Like someone in a village somewhere gets access to like a multi-sig that them and their community builders can all work on and build from. That's going to be what really changes everything.
Yeah, 100%. I'm super excited for that. Okay, so I've got a few final questions wrapping this episode up. The first is looking ahead of the future, what are some new models of DAOs that you'd love to see play out in, the next year, let's say?
Interesting. You mean just like models in a macro sense?
Yeah, so like today we already have so many different categories of DAOs. We have service DAOs, we have investment DAOs, we have creator DAOs, all of these different kinds. But I'm sure there are categories of DAOs that have not been thought up yet. Can you think of any categories that you would like to see, or maybe, just categories that you would like to see more of that already exist, but maybe we don't see much of yet?
I'm definitely interested in seeing the idea of the collector DAO, which is typically focused on NFTs or something that's just like very expensive. I'm really interested to see what that looks like in different forms. Like what else do people want? That doesn't necessarily need, a lot of money to get or even just a lot of people to get. Like what that's the question I don't know the answer to. I have no idea what that's gonna look like, but I think in the future it's gonna be really interesting. I definitely think, shout out to Pack DAO. They are focused on mutual aid, but as a DAO. And I think that concept is going to be really interesting, especially as more communities decide to use the technology to help each other, right? Or to empower people. Like, what does a mutual aid DAO look like? What does it look like when you have multiple of them kind of communicating and networking with each other? That's something I'm really excited about, actually. And something that's also probably going to be more important than most of what we're doing now.
For sure. Okay, second question. Give me your best case scenario and worst case scenario for DAOs in 5 years.
5 years, okay. Best case scenario, we achieved the solar punk full human coordination, all by collaborating with each other and coordinating with each other. Worst case, and let's say 10 years. So that answer would be the answer for 10 years. And worst case, I would say we just completely fail and no one wants to use DAOs and everyone hates it. I do think that scenario is probably more likely than the full dystopian scenario. I hope, at least. But yeah, I kind of think that the worst case scenario is just like none of this works. At the end of the day, everyone hates it, and we just go back to what we're already used to. Or we build DAOs with decentralization and autonomy in mind, and then we're just like, screw this. We're just gonna recreate what's already been there, but on chain.
Yeah, basically we make the same mistakes we made with the web in the past. And we're like, in the beginning, like in the early days of the web too, we wanted everything to be decentralized, and then look what happened. So you can't say that that's, it's not going to happen again. It definitely is a possibility. Sure. Okay, and then last question. What is one hot take you have about DAOs?
Oh, wow.
I feel like you've already given some, actually. In this
I feel like
episode,
all my takes are hot takes. That's a good question. I'd say, honestly, the biggest one for me is kind of what I said already. Like, we are not, and I mean, like, the entire space is not looking at what's come before, at least not enough. We're not using the right mental models in a lot of ways. We still use either Web 2 or just very businessy ways to think about DAOs. But like, we're not building companies, we're building active communities, right? So we need to think about it in ways that actually align more with what that looks like, whether it's ecology, I talk about a lot, or like more cooperative structure, more like maybe even anarchistic structured mental models. And there's just been so much writing and so much that we can see in history that would help a lot in how we're thinking about DAOs now.
I feel like we could record a whole other episode on DAO anarchy. I'd love to hear your takes there.
Absolutely. Shout out to Perdon.
Okay, well, last thing, Stefen, on every podcast episode, we wrap up with a quick little game called This or That. That's where I give you two words, and A or B, and you just tell me which one you prefer. Okay. There's no explanation needed for any of this. It's just real quick lightning round. I've got 10 pairs of words for you. Are you ready to go?
Oh, boy.
Okay, first one, Bitcoin or Ethereum?
Ethereum.
Okay, crypto or Web3?
Web3.
DAOs or NFTs?
DAOs.
Bear market or bull market?
Build market.
Somebody else said that too. Oh my gosh, you guys are clever in the same way. Okay, next one, building or investing?
Building.
Culture or tech?
Oh, wow. God, culture.
Okay, books or podcasts?
Damn. I mean,
You can say books.
I'll say books. I'll say books.
Okay. Past or future?
Ooh, future.
Damn, after everything you said about how we
I know.
past and you still pick future? Okay.
I know. That was a really hard one.
All right. Nassau or New York City?
I don't like this one. Pass. No. I'll go with NASA.
Okay, and the last one, Earth or space?
Space.
Nice. Yeah, I kind of feel bad for people that I'm already friends with who come on the pod because then I can target you so much harder and make these difficult. But all right, great job. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on, Stefen, and sharing all your wisdom and knowledge with us. Before you go, last thing, tell people where they can find you if they want to follow you or connect with you after this episode, and where people can go to learn more about Govrn or about the Caribbean Blockchain Alliance or anything else you want to plug.
Sure. I'm on Twitter way too much. Stef Delev, SDEFDELEV. You can also find Caribbean Blockchain Alliance at CBA Hub and at cbahub.org. You can also find Govrn at Govrn HQ and Govrn.io. Now, that's Govrn, Govrn. E.
Gotta leave out the vowels in the naming of these companies nowadays, right? Thanks again so much, Stefen. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll be back again soon with another episode of Rehash.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Rehash, a Web3 podcast. The guest on this episode, Stefen, was nominated by Diana Chen and voted onto the podcast by Zaku, Dame, Bezod, Triumph, Zaji, and Diana Chen. Some of the questions you heard were submitted by Karsten. Rehash is hosted by Diana Chen, produced and edited by Ellie Dots and Tyler Internet, and as always, supported by Rehash DAO. To stay up to date on all things Rehash, you can follow us on Twitter at RehashWeb3 and join our Discord to get involved.